A whole city disappeared in minutes. St. Pierre, the bustling port of Martinique, was a place of markets, cafes, and sugar ships in May 1902. Then Mount Pelée unleashed a blast that turned streets into ruins and lives into stories you can still hear today. People were going about their morning like any other day. Vendors shouted prices, children chased each other between stalls, and sailors hauled cargo. So when a dark column rose from the mountain, most thought it was bad weather or a distant storm, not the start of the deadliest volcanic event of the modern Caribbean. A blistering cloud rushed down the slope and into the town. That cloud, hot gas, ash, and rock we now call a pyroclastic flow, moved faster than anyone could run and burned everything in its path. And because the town sat in the path of the valley, the destruction was almost instantaneous, leaving only a handful of survivors and hundreds of silent streets. The aftermath looked like a photograph of silence. You'll hear the voices of those few who lived through it, see the photographs and eyewitness accounts that correct the myths, and understand, step by step, how a single eruption reshaped a community and changed the way the world thinks about volcanic danger. 1. St. Pierre on Martinique sat beneath Mount Pelée and was the island's leading city. From the harbour, the mountain looked like a wall pressing the town toward the sea. Narrow streets climbed a short distance up from the quay and then stopped where steep ravines cut into the flank of the volcano, so the city could never sprawl inland the way other ports did. That closeness produced a clear pattern. Fertile ash on the hills fed rich cane fields below, and those fields fed warehouses and ships along the wharf. Because the slopes drained directly toward the bay, every heavy rain funneled down the same channels that sailors and merchants used to bring goods ashore. The waterfront was busy with activity most days. Steamers tied up alongside low stone piers with stacks of sugar hogsheads and casks of rum ready to be loaded, while smaller schooners ducked in to pick up local produce and supplies for the plantations. Shipping lines called regularly, and consular agents and commercial houses kept offices near the docks so deals could be struck quickly. As a result, money flowed into town, and warehouses, banks, and custom houses rose where the shoreline offered the best moorings. People spoke of the city in comfortable, almost proud terms. There were theatres, cafes with shaded terraces, and streets lined with 2- and 3-story masonry buildings that showed a level of wealth you didn't always see on an island. Merchants entertained visiting planters and European passengers in hotel dining rooms, and the local press printed shipping news and cultural commentary every week. That urban culture was a direct outcome of trade. Prosperity paid for public works, schools, and the kinds of social institutions that make a place feel like the island centre. All of those advantages had a practical flip side. Because commerce, administration, and social life were concentrated in one compact area at the mountain's foot, the city's population, roughly 28,000 people by contemporary accounts, lived and worked in a clustered, bustling environment. Banks, warehouses, municipal buildings, and the busiest streets sat within the same narrow corridor between slope and sea. Concentration made the town efficient and prosperous, but it also meant that any hazard moving down from a volcano would find a dense, well-used target. 2. In spring 1902, volcanic activity increased, yet the city largely continued as normal. Mornings began to carry a new weight, a low rumble underfoot, a faint smell of sulfur that threaded through the alleys. Scientists later identified those sounds as shallow earthquakes and increased fumarolic activity high on the volcano slopes. Ash came down in thin, grey dust on laundry and cobblestones, enough to be noticed but not to shut the market. People swept it up and went on. The market stalls stayed busy. Merchants who handled sugar, rum, and imported goods kept counting and bargaining, and ships still unloaded in the harbour. Sailors complained about the smell and nervously checked rigging, but the steamers that connected Martinique with other Caribbean ports continued to run, keeping commerce moving. Business needs and debts pushed life forward in concrete ways. There was unease in conversations, but public life barely paused. The theatre hosted performances and cafes filled with men reading the morning paper. Those who worked for the colonial administration reported for duty. Local officials broadcast reassurances through the press and by telegram, which calmed many and reinforced the idea that the danger was remote. That official tone made people think the trouble was up the mountain and that the town itself was safe. Some people did act on the signs. Farm families in the foothills packed belongings and walked to safer valleys, and a few ships sailing past the island chose to put to sea rather than anchor. But those departures were patchy and measured, not mass panic. As a result, the city remained full of life, with most residents choosing routine over flight until the situation changed beyond expectation. 3. On May 8, 1902, An eruption produced a pyroclastic flow that reached the city within minutes. There was a normal bustle in the streets of St. Pierre that morning. People going to work, merchants opening shops, sailors unloading cargo. The calm broke with a tremendous sound from the volcano, and then the mountain sent out a glowing, racing cloud that swept down its slopes. That cloud was a pyroclastic flow, a searing avalanche of gas, ash, and volcanic debris, and it reached the town in minutes, giving almost no time for anyone to run. The flow didn't arrive like ordinary falling ash. It formed when the eruptive column and parts of the dome collapsed, and that collapse turned hot rock and gas into a ground-hugging surge. Because the mixture was largely gas at high temperature carrying pulverized rock and glass, it traveled along ravines and streets with crushing force and heat. Eyewitness accounts describe a black, billowing wall and a roar like a passing train. The cloud smothered the harbor and pushed through the alleys faster than people could react. What happened inside St. Pierre was immediate and brutal. Buildings that were only moments before full of life were overwhelmed by an incandescent cloud that ignited roofs, shattered windows with pressure, and filled rooms with choking, superheated gas. Very few people survived. Some accounts point to a prisoner who endured the heat inside a stone cell and to residents on the town's fringes who escaped by happenstance, but most of the population was caught in the surge. The combination of thermal shock, asphyxiation, and 4. Destruction and loss were massive, and the urban infrastructure was wiped out. The town that had been full of markets and narrow streets turned into a furnace in an instant, and brick and wood offered no protection. A searing cloud of ash and gas raced through the avenues and slammed into buildings, tearing roofs off and collapsing walls as if someone had wiped them from a map. Houses, shops, and the grand public halls that once echoed with music were reduced to hot rubble. Wooden shutters charred away, ballrooms and warehouses blackened to their bones. The heat wasn't just a burn, it was a structural failure. Timber snapped, plaster slid off walls, and whole blocks lost their load-bearing members so quickly they pancaked under their own weight. The city's lifelines failed right behind the first shock, and the loss of those systems multiplied the damage. Water mains fractured under the weight and heat, leaving wells clogged with ash and making any attempt at firefighting impossible. Telegraph and telephone lines melted or fell, cutting St. Pierre off from outside help in the hours when a message might have mattered most. Docks that once handled sugar and rum shipments were splintered and buried, so even coastal rescue by ship was hampered by twisted pilings and burning cargo. Streets choked with scalding debris turned movement into a deadly challenge, and that made rescue and recovery almost impossible in the critical window after the surge. Cars and carts were trapped under fallen masonry, and the tram tracks that ran through the town were warped or buried so completely they were unusable. People who might have fled found routes cut off by collapsed bridges and ankle-deep layers of hot pumice. A handful of people sheltered in cellars or a stone prison cell survived, but the majority found no refuge. Entire neighborhoods were rendered unlivable, their infrastructure, sewers, hospitals, and markets annihilated. The scale of physical loss forced a complete reset of urban life, and rebuilding meant starting from a blank slate. Official buildings, bank vaults, and municipal archives were destroyed or lost in the flames and ash, taking legal records and civic memory with them. Industrial and commercial veins, warehouses, mills, and the small manufacturing shops that fed the town lay in ruins, so the local economy was gone along with the streets. Clearing the site itself took years because the ash and debris were not just heavy, they were dangerous and hot, and the basic framework of the town had been erased faster than any plan could be drawn. 5. The event entered history as one of the deadliest volcanic disasters to strike a major city. A bustling port city with streets full of markets and cafes was suddenly gone, and the scale of loss is what marks the event in history. Roughly 28,000 people lived in St. Pierre, and almost all of them perished when the eruption struck. The casualty count wasn't spread across scattered villages. It hit an organized urban center where families, businesses, and civic life were concentrated, which multiplied the human impact. Because the deaths occurred in a single, dense population hub, the disaster stands out among volcanic catastrophes. People could not outrun the main hazard. A fast-moving pyroclastic flow, a blisteringly hot mix of gas, ash, and volcanic fragments, swept down the volcano's flank and slammed into the city, destroying buildings and killing residents within minutes. When a 30-meter-high wall of superheated gas and ash travels at hundreds of kilometers per hour, masonry and people are overwhelmed in an instant. Only a handful survived that immediate blast. 2 of the better-known survivors were Louis-Auguste Cyprus, a man inside a sturdy prison cell, and Leon Compelliandre, who somehow escaped the worst by being outside the city's core. The destruction altered more than roofs and streets. as the city's merchants, sugar exporters, administrative offices, and cultural institutions were wiped out. The colonial economy and governance on the island were thrown into disarray. Ships in the harbour were caught in the chaos, and rescue efforts were hampered by heat, ash, and uncertainty, so relief could not reach survivors quickly. With no functioning local authority left, relief and rebuilding were slow and disjointed, making the tragedy not only immediate but also long-lasting in its social and economic consequences. Because an entire regional capital was effectively erased, the event became a reference point for how deadly a volcanic eruption could be when it struck an urban population. It shifted the way scientists and officials thought about volcanic risk in populated areas and stayed in public memory through survivor stories and the ruined cityscape that remained. Personal accounts, like Cyprus's later appearances in public shows and Compelliandre's testimony about sudden heat and silence, kept the human dimension alive and ensured the catastrophe would be remembered as one of the deadliest to befall a major city. You know that sinking feeling when a normal morning suddenly goes wrong. On May 8, 1902, Mount Pelée exploded. A violent dome collapse sent superheated gas and ash rushing down the slopes, and those pyroclastic flows hit St. Pierre with such force and speed that roughly 28 people were killed, whole streets were flattened, and only a handful of survivors, like the prisoner Louis-Auguste Cyprus whose stone cell protected him, walked away to tell the tale. It could have been any town on any day. People were buying fish, going to work, and theatre rehearsals were underway. Officials underestimated the danger and warnings were confused or ignored. And because of that human error and the sudden nature of the eruption, neighborhoods went from ordinary life straight to devastation in minutes. We can't change what happened, but remembering matters. If this story stayed with you, sharing it, reading survivor accounts, or visiting museums and memorials when you can helps keep those lives from becoming just a statistic. And if you want more historical, eyewitness, and geological detail, you can follow the channel so future videos find you. The past still has more to say. Upcoming episodes will bring eyewitness testimony, old photographs, and the geological maps that show why Pelée was so deadly and how communities on Martinique rebuilt afterward. More close-up, human storytelling to help that awful day stay remembered.